Do you know who is probably the most reviled individual in America in the 21st century? It's not former President Donald Trump. He actually has a significant number of devotees. It's unlikely to be billionaire Bill Gates either, since a man who converts human waste into potable water isn't someone that garners animosity. Even Jeffrey Epstein, the well-known financier charged with sex trafficking minors, doesn't quite take this dubious crown. While he is indeed a strong contender for the title of ultimate villain, he likely falls short when stacked against the figure occasionally compared to Hitler in the U.S. Indeed, it's Bernie Madoff, the con artist who swindled a jaw-dropping $65 billion. That's an immense sum. Many nations operate with annual budgets smaller than that. However, Madoff is not the protagonist of this narrative. Our focus is solely on the methods he employed to abscond with such vast wealth. In Russian-language media, you may encounter the term financial pyramid, which isn't entirely appropriate. According to the American press, Madoff is known as the architect of the largest Ponzi scheme in history. This is not merely a term or abbreviation. It is a surname that might be associated with the most infamous swindler in history. It was this individual 100 years ago who concocted a scheme that has the potential to position the fraudster among the wealthiest individuals on earth. This narrative goes beyond that of an extraordinary adventurer, although Ponzi is indeed a fascinating character. It also unfolds into a tale of masterful deception, an extraordinary scheme of fraud that, and it's not an abbreviation, it is indeed a surname that potentially belongs to the most notorious fraudster in history. This is the individual who, 100 years ago, crafted a scheme that could elevate the fraudster to the ranks of the wealthiest individuals on the planet. This narrative is not solely about an astonishing adventurer, although he certainly is an intriguing figure. It also encompasses a remarkable deception, a masterful scheme of fraud that continues to resonate today. If you believe you're too clever and logical to be duped by a scam, you're highly mistaken. All right, music. Presently, there are 8 billion people inhabiting the earth. I'm certain that the majority have contemplated the path to wealth. More often than not, this question is expressed with a greater urgency: how to get rich quickly. Naturally, each person's definition of wealth varies, whether it's the balance in their bank account, the number of homes or cars they own, or perhaps their collection of gold jewelry. It's all very personal. Nonetheless, we constantly desire more than what we currently possess, and ideally, we'd like to attain it with minimal effort. This relatable human impulse serves as an ideal target for con artists. That's why so many of us have received calls or text messages claiming to be from our banks, trying to gain access to our accounts. Who hasn't been inundated with various spam emails about fraudulent charities or alerts regarding unexpected bank card suspensions? There are con artists who still favor personal interaction and visit elderly women door to door, sometimes managing to extract considerable amounts of money from them. Who hasn't received phone calls or text messages claiming to be from their bank, attempting to gain access to their accounts? Who hasn't been flooded with various spam emails about fraudulent charities or notifications regarding unexpected bank card blocks? There are con artists who still prefer direct interaction, going door to door to target elderly women, occasionally extracting substantial sums from them. Some of these schemes are more effective than others, but none will lead you to earn $5 billion. As history demonstrates, the most effective way to deceive us of our money isn't through fear or compassion, but through our urge to earn substantial amounts quickly. This is why ambitious fraudsters opt to establish financial pyramids. Bernie Madoff's scheme garnered global attention, but it barely impacted the residents of post-Soviet countries. It's unlikely that any of you invested in an American investment fund, yet we have numerous examples of our own. The most well-known of these is MMM, run by Mavrodi. It wasn't the only pyramid scheme of the 90s, and if you weren't affected, then surely someone in your family, circle of friends, or acquaintances lost money in it. It would seem that everyone recognizes the telltale signs of a financial pyramid from afar. Who in their right mind would choose to invest money there? Yet, it turns out that many people do. Dry statistics reveal that in 2020, 200 financial pyramids were identified in Russia, and this is only the beginning. At the very least, someone in your family, circle of friends, or acquaintances undoubtedly lost money in it. It seems that everyone recognizes the obvious signs of a financial pyramid from afar. Who in their right mind would invest there? Yet many do. Dry statistics show that in 2020, 200 financial pyramids were identified in Russia, and this is just the starting point. Just 3 years later, that number has increased tenfold. Tenfold, can you believe it? The most notable example in recent years is undoubtedly Cashbery. This pyramid was endorsed by show business celebrities and popular YouTube bloggers. Ultimately, investors lost several billion rubles. If you believe you are too clever to be deceived by something like this, you are gravely mistaken. Financial pyramids are designed much more cleverly than they seem. Their victims encompass intelligent, educated, and rational individuals from all corners of the globe. To understand why this occurs, let's travel back in time to a century ago. It's 1920 in Boston, USA. Charles is a prominent businessman, owning a large house complete with servants, multiple cars at a time when owning even one was considered extravagant, along with diamonds and commercial real estate throughout the city. In short, he isn't just wealthy, he's ultra-wealthy, with his fortune estimated at $15 million. To put this staggering sum into perspective, it's worth noting that a car in 1920 cost just $500. Multiple cars at a time when even one was regarded as a luxury, in addition to diamonds and commercial real estate scattered throughout the city. In essence, he isn't just wealthy, he is exceptionally wealthy. His fortune is estimated at $15 million. To comprehend the magnitude of this amount, it's sufficient to understand that a car in 1920 cost just $500. Charles is not yet 40. He isn't the offspring of billionaires, nor did he discover an oil field or invent a groundbreaking technology. Instead, he devised something even more remarkable, a scheme that would enable him to amass incredible wealth in just 6 months. A plan that would remain effective even a century later. Ultimately, a scheme that would bear his name, Ponzi. I'll share a secret with you. This channel could have looked entirely different or might not have existed at all. Honestly, no videos, no hundreds of thousands of subscribers. The reason is simple. Most of the content used for preparing the videos is in English, and there's simply not much available in Russian. In order to learn how to write scripts, I decided to study from the best and discovered Hollywood movie scripts. It turns out that scripts aren't like books. No one translates them. Seriously, not a single word in Russian. It's fortunate that a few years back, I chose to make a significant change in my life and learned English. To put it briefly, I may not be an investment guru, but I can confidently say that learning English and discovered Hollywood movie scripts, it became clear that scripts aren't like books. No one translates them. Seriously, not a single word in Russian. It's a fortunate turn of events that a few years ago, I decided to make a significant change in my life and learned English. To sum it up, I may not be an investment guru, but I can assert with confidence that learning English is the best investment of both time and money, especially when taught by experienced instructors from the online school Inlex. One of the key benefits of the school is its meticulous approach to selecting teachers, with only 1% of applicants qualifying to be instructors at Inlex. This ensures you are in trustworthy hands, and having a good mentor is a vital ingredient for success. The teaching system at Inlex is designed so that students begin speaking English from the very first lesson. From my own experience, I can say this aspect is critically important. One reason many individuals still struggle to speak English after attending general education schools is the shortage of practice. At Inlex, you have one-on-one interaction with the instructor, and a substantial part of the lesson is focused on language practice. You'll start noticing progress very quickly. Once you achieve a certain level, it's beneficial to take lessons with a native speaker, and this opportunity is also offered at Inlex. All classes at the school are conducted on its own platform. Interaction with instructors, textbooks, homework, vocabulary exercises, everything is available online. With one instructor, a large segment of the lesson is devoted to language practice. You'll start noticing progress quite rapidly once you reach a certain level. It's valuable to experience lessons with a native speaker, and this opportunity is also available at Inlex. All classes at the school are held on its own platform. Interaction with instructors, textbooks, homework, vocabulary exercises, everything is conveniently located online in one place. This makes it very convenient. You can study from anywhere without spending time on transportation. Additionally, you can check the class schedule. Sign up for your first free lesson at Inlex to get a first-hand look at the instructor and teaching system. You'll also receive a 40% discount on your first payment for lessons with a Russian-speaking instructor. Just remember to use the promo code Loganov. I'll leave the link in the description. Don't delay until tomorrow. Learning English will surely transform your life. Charles's rise to fame was swift. In 1920, his name dominated the front pages of American newspapers. But just a year prior, few people knew who he was. Like many other tales of notable figures from the United States, this one traces its roots far beyond the American continent. In a small Italian town called Lugo, situated in the north of the country, a son was born to the Ponzi family in the early 1880s. The first 20 years of Charles's life in his homeland remained quite unclear, and are primarily known through his own accounts. What can be asserted with certainty is that it starts far beyond the American continent in a small Italian town named Lugo, located in the northern part of the country during the early 1880s. A son was born to the Ponzi family. The initial 20 years of Charles's life in his homeland are somewhat unclear and are mostly derived from his own accounts. What can be confirmed is that he was certainly not known as Charles Ponzi at that time. Carlo Pietro Giovanni Teobaldo Ponzi is the full name of our protagonist. At the time of his birth, his family was no longer as affluent as they once were, but they still retained some remnants of their wealth. This enabled Charles to enroll at the University of Rome. During his time there, as Ponzi himself noted, he fell into that phase of youth where spending money feels like the most exciting pursuit on earth. Speaking candidly, Carlo exhausted all his resources within just a few years. For many Europeans in the early 20th century, emigrating to the States appeared to be a practical solution to their financial struggles, a place where one could strike it rich with only $1 to spare, the American dream. In that regard, Ponzi would become a prime example of this idea. In 1903, he arrived at the port of Boston carrying $2 bills and dreams worth of fortune. However, the next 15 years did not bring Ponzi any closer to realizing his ambitions. You could achieve wealth without a dime to your name, the American dream. In a way, Ponzi would exemplify this notion. In 1903, he reached the port of Boston with $2 bills and dreams valued at $1 million. However, the subsequent 15 years did not bring Ponzi any closer to fulfilling his aspirations. By that time, the name Carlo had already been adapted to the more recognizable American name, Charles. He worked as a waiter in New York, painted road signs in Florida, and managed with a variety of temporary jobs. By 1917, Ponzi made his way back to Boston to take up a position as a clerk at an advertising agency. A year later, he married a humble girl named Rose and switched jobs again. Charles started to get involved in a small fruit business owned by his wife's parents. However, he encountered failure once more as the venture soon went bankrupt. In 1919, he became enthusiastic about the concept of launching an international trade magazine to generate income from advertising in the publication. To pursue this, he required investments. Ponzi sought a loan from a bank, but was refused. It appeared that for the Hexagon NT, the so-called international reply coupons were included in the envelope. With these coupons, someone mailing a letter could pay for the return postage. In other words, Ponzi, upon receiving a letter in America, could exchange these coupons for stamps and use them to send a reply letter to Spain at no cost. At this moment in time, what was included in the envelope for the Hexagon NT were the so-called international reply coupons. With these, the sender of a letter could cover the return postage. In other words, Ponzi, upon receiving a letter in America, could trade these coupons for stamps and use them to send a reply letter to Spain at no charge. At that moment, a business plan began to develop in Charles's mind. The concept was as follows. The U.S. economy was already considerably stronger than those of many other countries around the globe, setting the wheels of his future scheme in motion. For instance, Ponzi's European colleague could purchase an international coupon in Spain and dispatch it to the U.S. There, Ponzi could exchange it for a postage stamp himself. A stamp in America cost 5 cents. This stamp could be sold to someone for that same 5 cents. However, since the American currency was stronger than the Spanish currency, it became clear that the international coupons bought in Spain were actually worth considerably less than 5 cents. Thus, Ponzi understood that he needed to gather a large number of people who would buy these international coupons in bulk from countries with weak economies, send them to the U.S., exchange those coupons for stamps there, and then sell the stamps to Americans at the same price of 5 cents. In Charles's view, the profits from such a scheme could soar to as much as 400%. Indeed, for now. People who would purchase these international coupons in bulk from countries with weak economies and send them to the U.S. There, they would exchange the coupons for stamps and sell those stamps to Americans at the same price of 5 cents. In Charles's opinion, the profit from such a scheme could potentially reach up to 400%. Agreeing for now, it doesn't appear to be the most brilliant plan in history. In fact, it doesn't even resemble a scheme at all. In the early 1920s, there was apparently nothing illegal about this at all. However, the most fascinating aspect is this. Due to the idea involving the stamps, Charles Ponzi would become a dollar millionaire in just 6 months, while his company would sell virtually no stamps whatsoever. How did he accomplish that? In the early 1920s, Charles Ponzi established a new company, naming it Security Change Company, and began promoting it. To commence buying postage coupons in bulk, investments were required. To draw in investors, it was essential to provide attractive terms. A return of 50% on the invested amount in just 3 months sounded appealing. Soon, the offer became even more enticing, a 50% profit in just a month and a half. However, Ponzi recognized that attracting investors for a new company, even with such tempting proposals, was challenging. People needed to be persuaded, and this was accomplished in several stages. First and foremost, no one. A return of 50% on the invested amount in just 3 months was indeed enticing. Before long, the offer turned even more attractive, 50% profit in merely a month and a half. However, Ponzi realized that attracting investors for a fledgling company, even with such alluring proposals, was no easy feat. People needed to be persuaded, and this was achieved through several stages. First and foremost, no one will invest their money in exchange for mere generous promises. There must be a solid business underpinning these promises that generates substantial income. From this income, investors would receive their substantial returns. For this, Ponzi already had the concept of international coupons and stamps in mind. Prospective investors were informed about the potential 400% profit arising from price differences across various countries, as well as the extensive network of agents throughout Europe who were involved in purchasing coupons for Ponzi. This entire narrative seemed like a fantastic business opportunity only on the surface. Ponzi had no plans to purchase any coupons whatsoever. All he required was the money from investors. Charles's second brilliant tactic was this. He decided to embrace the well-known principle of fake it until you make it. This can be roughly translated into Russian as «Притворяйся, пока не сделаешь это правдой». For people to begin investing their money in the enterprise, they must perceive that the company, and primarily its. To encourage people to invest their money in the enterprise, they must perceive that the company, and primarily its owner, is successful and affluent. After all, if that is true, it indicates that the individual genuinely understands the business and can be trusted with their finances. Charles Ponzi presented himself as a man of considerable wealth. He visited cafes, clubs, and sporting events frequently, made connections, and, naturally, socialized. He shaped an image of a successful, busy, yet approachable investment expert. Meanwhile, Charles refrained from mentioning the prospect of investing in his company, as one of the key secrets of a successful financial pyramid is not to actively recruit individuals. It is crucial to create an environment where people come eager on their own and demand to invest their money. Thus, Ponzi introduced the topic of potential investments in his company only after he had established a solid relationship with the individual, and he approached it very subtly. Charles accomplished his goal, and gradually, people started bringing in their money. For the modest stream of investments to transform into a substantial flow, there was just one final step required in constructing the financial pyramid: to pay out the earned returns to the initial investors. Charles started discussing potential investments in his company only after he had formed a good rapport with the individual, and he did so in a very discreet manner. Charles succeeded in his goal, and gradually, people began to contribute their money, transforming the modest stream of investments into a powerful flow. There was just one last step necessary in constructing the financial pyramid: to pay the earned returns to the initial investors. This is precisely what Charles Ponzi accomplished just 1 month later. An immediate question arises: where did he obtain the money if no stamps or coupons had been sold? The answer is straightforward. The returns to the initial investors were dispersed from the contributions of new investors. Thus, the final piece was set in place for a successful financial pyramid. As they witnessed returns being paid and individuals reaping astounding profits, new investors became relentless. Furthermore, the first investors, recognizing that the scheme was functioning, started to reinvest their already earned profits back into Ponzi's company. Brilliant, to put it simply. Ponzi's pyramid was primarily constructed not on financial principles, but rather on psychological ones. This is what made the scheme so effective. People started pouring in their money at an unparalleled pace. In just 6 months, by mid-1920, the number of investors soared to several tens of thousands. Naturally, Charles Ponzi himself couldn't manage such an influx of investments. He trained a team of managers who brought in new investors, earning 10% from their contributions. These managers recruited. The scheme proved to be so effective that people began contributing their money at an extraordinary pace. In just 6 months, by mid-1920, the number of investors grew to several tens of thousands. Naturally, Charles Ponzi couldn't manage such a massive influx himself. He trained a team of managers who drew in new investors, earning 10% from their contributions. These managers, in turn, recruited new managers who worked for a 5% profit. Thus, Ponzi effectively established a squared pyramid, benefiting both clients and managers alike. The scheme devised by Ponzi was, if not genius, at least rather skillful. However, this is not the sole trickery in this tale. The very scheme that our protagonist successfully executed, which will forever be associated with Ponzi, existed a century prior to his birth. The human desire to amass wealth quickly did not begin in the 20th century, but much earlier. It is reasonable to conclude that the history of financial pyramids extends far beyond just one century. 1880, in the same Boston city. 50-year-old Sarah Howe managed to prosper through the investments of newcomers. The only difference was the narrative: Deposit Company. This was the name of Sarah's business, which accepted investments exclusively from women. One must commend the audacity of the scammer. In the latter half of the 19th century, she established a business directed solely at women. However, ultimately, Sarah defrauded nearly $500,000 from her female clients. The only distinction was the lore surrounding the Deposit Company, which was the name of Sarah's venture. She exclusively accepted investments from women. One must commend the audacity of the fraudster. In the latter half of the 19th century, as a woman, she established a business targeted solely toward women. However, in the end, Sarah swindled nearly $500,000 from her own gender. It seems she was both a feminist and an anti-feminist simultaneously. It's quite complex, but that's not the main focus. The crux of the matter is that the story of Sarah Howe isn't the earliest instance of a Ponzi scheme. In the first year, Scottish traveler Gregor MacGregor set sail from Central America to Great Britain. Upon his arrival, he introduced himself as His Majesty Gregor, the chief of Poyais. Poyais was described as a small nation in Central America, boasting a remarkable climate and fertile soils that permitted several harvests each year. It was said to have deposits of gold, tobacco plantations, and much more. Every pound invested in this country could yield astonishing returns. All the allure of the mythical country was detailed in a pamphlet by another British traveler. MacGregor himself established an office in central London, initiated an advertising campaign, and began taking investments. He promised returns significantly higher than those available on the London Stock Exchange at that time. Investing in Latin American countries was regarded as a highly advantageous opportunity in Britain during that era. Were detailed in a pamphlet by another British traveler. MacGregor himself set up an office in central London, initiated an advertising campaign, and began to accept investments. He promised returns several times greater than what the London Stock Exchange could offer for Latin American investments at that time. It was regarded as an excellent investment opportunity in Britain during that period. In his office, MacGregor sold currency, securities, and land. His venture expanded rapidly, and when converted to modern currency, the total of investments reached several tens of millions of dollars. The only issue was that Poyais did not exist. It was a fictitious country with an invented currency and fabricated tales of unimaginable riches. MacGregor deceived several members of British high society, though their gullibility can be understood. Many Latin American countries were emerging as new independent states during that period. It is easy to envision that among the numerous names like Chile, Grenada, Somalia, Nicaragua, and Colombia, Poyais could also be included. These two instances are sufficient to illustrate that financial pyramids are a relatively old phenomenon. However, this does not clarify why the Howe scheme or the MacGregor scheme remain largely unknown, while many are familiar with the Ponzi scheme. As is widely recognized, making a mark in history doesn't require inventing something new. It is often enough to reiterate something old, but with an innovative twist. Financial pyramids are indeed a rather old phenomenon. Nevertheless, this doesn't shed light on why we remain unaware of the Howe scheme or the MacGregor scheme, while many are familiar with the Ponzi scheme. It is well known that making a name in history doesn't require inventing something new. It's sufficient to reiterate an old concept, but in a manner that no one has previously attempted. This is precisely what Charles Ponzi accomplished. He discovered the concept of financial pyramids not through books or newspapers, but through his personal experience. Throughout the lengthy 15 years from his arrival in the States in 1903 to his return to Boston in 1917, Charles not only worked as a waiter and painted road signs, but also spent time in prison. The situation unfolded as follows. In 1907, after several unsuccessful years in the States, he chose to seek his fortune in Canada. In Montreal, he secured a position at Rossi Bank, an establishment founded by another Italian immigrant. The institution seemed to be a prosperous bank. Clients eagerly made deposits in exchange for attractive interest rates. In reality, however, the bank functioned on the principle of a financial pyramid. Interest for existing depositors was paid using the investments of new clients. At that time, no one was aware of the imminent collapse, and this scheme was commonly described as taking from Peter to pay Paul. In brief, the bank eventually fell apart, and its founder fled to Mexico in exchange for attractive interest rates. However, in truth, the bank functioned on the principle of a financial pyramid. Interest for existing depositors was paid from the investments of new ones. At that time, no one was aware of the looming collapse, and thus this scheme was dubbed taking from Peter to pay Paul. In summary, the bank collapsed, and its founder fled to Mexico, taking the depositors' money with him. Charles Ponzi found himself once again unemployed and without funds. This pushed him to commit a desperate act. He wrote a check for $400 in his name from one of the bank's former clients. As a result of this forgery, Charles was imprisoned for 3 years. Upon returning to the States, he quickly found himself imprisoned once more, this time for assisting Italian illegal immigrants in crossing the border. After being released from prison 2 years later, he struggled to get by with a series of temporary jobs. Several more years went by before Charles organized one of the most notorious financial pyramids in history. Now, it's time to return to the mid-1920s, at a moment when Charles Ponzi was enjoying the height of his success, surrounded by a collection of real estate, a limousine, and millions of dollars from unsuspecting depositors. Although the authorities had been keeping a close watch on this exceptionally successful business for several months, there was no basis for a comprehensive investigation, let alone any charges. The older depositors were receiving their... It's time to revisit the mid-1920s, when Charles Ponzi was at the height of his success, surrounded by a portfolio of real estate, a limousine, and millions of dollars from unsuspecting depositors. Although the authorities had been observing this overly successful business for several months, there were no justifications for an exhaustive investigation, much less any accusations. The existing depositors were receiving their funds, and new ones were eagerly making investments. The ones who didn't remain passive were the journalists. The notion that someone could accumulate a vast fortune in just 6 months raised suspicions, particularly since Charles Ponzi disclosed no details. In response to all inquiries regarding the specifics of his business involving stamps and coupons, he maintained that it was a trade secret. One of the Boston newspapers launched an investigation. This inquiry revealed that to attain multi-million-dollar profits, Charles Ponzi needed to sell over 100 million stamps. However, at that time, only several tens of thousands had been printed by the American Postal Service. Right after the article revealing Ponzi's scheme was published, a crowd gathered outside his office. They sought to retrieve their money, and Ponzi was even willing to return it. He disbursed more than $1 million, which somewhat eased the depositors' fears. However, there were no transactions occurring with the buying and selling of coupons. Just consider this. Charles Ponzi successfully raised $15 million based on a business concept involving stamps. How much money do you think that truly is? A crowd assembled outside the office, eager to reclaim their money, and Ponzi was even willing to return it. He disbursed over $1 million, which helped to somewhat ease the situation. However, no transactions involving the buying and selling of coupons were occurring. Just think about it. Charles Ponzi raised $15 million based on a business idea centered on stamps. How much money do you think was actually used to acquire the stamps? At $60 per stamp, it was simply a financial pyramid, the largest pyramid that ever existed. By that stage in the narrative, Charles Ponzi's downfall was as rapid as his ascent. By August 1920, just over 6 months later, his pyramid officially disintegrated. In November, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud. After his release, Charles moved to Florida. There, Ponzi aimed to construct a new financial pyramid during a period when the state was experiencing a real estate market boom. This time, Ponzi's promise was even more audacious than in the first pyramid, offering a 200% return on investments in just 60 days. However, the fraud did not succeed. Charles was quickly exposed and sentenced to a year in prison. After his release, he soon faced the threat of another imprisonment. Initially convicted by federal authorities for his fraud in Boston, Charles Ponzi was also susceptible to charges brought by individual states in the United States. The fraud failed to deliver returns on investments in just 60 days. Charles was swiftly exposed and sentenced to a year in prison. However, upon his release, he soon confronted the threat of further imprisonment. Initially, for his fraudulent activities in Boston, Charles Ponzi had been convicted by federal authorities. However, in the United States, each individual state can also file separate charges. Consequently, the authorities in Massachusetts, where Boston is located, decided to impose an additional 7 to 9 years on Ponzi. He fled to Texas to shave and grow a mustache. Ponzi intended to cross the border, but his attempt was unsuccessful. He was apprehended and imprisoned. Ponzi wasn't released until the mid-1930s, by which time he had gained a significant amount of weight. All European Japanese were sent back to their homeland in Italy. What transpired with Charles in the subsequent years is not well documented, but the most plausible version is as follows. In the late 1930s, he secured a decent job with an Italian airline and traveled to Brazil to forge business connections between the two countries. However, in 1941, due to the war, the Brazilian authorities shut down the branch of the company where Ponzi was employed. He stayed in Rio de Janeiro, managing on meager earnings from teaching English and French. According to some reports, in 1941, Charles suffered a heart attack, and from that point on, his health notably declined. 7 years later, Ponzi had a stroke. He was nearly completely. The branch of the company where Ponzi was employed was shut down. He stayed in Rio de Janeiro, managing to get by on modest earnings from teaching English and French. According to some reports, in 1941, Charles suffered a heart attack, and from that moment on, his health significantly worsened. 7 years later, Ponzi experienced a stroke and became nearly completely blind. Less than a year after that, Charles passed away in a charitable hospital in Rio de Janeiro. He had just $75 to his name. In one of his final interviews before his death, Ponzi described the scam in Boston as the greatest show. In some respects, he was correct. The scale and ingenuity of the fraud resulted in a scheme of deception, devised long before Ponzi, that continues to bear his name. His legacy endures and can even be said to flourish. Financial pyramids based on the Ponzi model continue to function globally, which may be the most intriguing aspect of this tale. In Russia, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases each year. Despite the widespread recognition of the MMM pyramid, about 50 cases of financial pyramids are still uncovered annually, even in the United States. Despite the events of 2008, when the enormous financial pyramid created by Bernard Madoff collapsed, leading to tens of billions of dollars in losses. Cases each year. Although it's likely that virtually everyone has heard of the MMM pyramid, approximately 50 cases of financial pyramids are still discovered annually, even in the United States. Despite the events of 2008, when the massive financial pyramid orchestrated by Bernard Madoff collapsed, causing tens of billions of dollars in losses and affecting thousands of victims, including prominent figures like Steven Spielberg, John Malkovich, Larry King, and others. These were smart, educated, and rational individuals. Furthermore, even seasoned investment firms lost money in Madoff's scheme, firms whose profession was to invest their clients' funds wisely. Madoff's secret lay in his skillful use of all of Ponzi's tactics, which he elevated to astonishing rates of return on investments. He also operated what was claimed to be a legitimate business, specifically a brokerage firm with substantial experience in the stock market. Many regarded Madoff as a seasoned investment expert, and rather than pursuing investors, they willingly entrusted him with their money. Additionally, the chance to invest in the MMM company was marketed as an exclusive opportunity. In reality, it turned out to be a ruse. All investment documents were produced in a basement. As for where Madoff truly invested the funds of his investors, it was into his own pocket. However, his scheme lasted not just a few months or years, but several decades. Furthermore, The opportunity to invest in the MFA company was portrayed as an exclusive chance. In reality, it was a sham, with all investment documents printed in a basement. The truth about where Madoff truly invested the investors' money is that it went into his own pocket. Remarkably, his scheme continued for not just 6 months or a couple of years, but several decades, and it could potentially still be in operation. After all, fundamentally, the only condition for a pyramid to endure is that the influx of investments from new investors must surpass the withdrawals requested by old investors. When you have what is purported to be a large, well-established investment company, achieving this is not particularly challenging. One might say that Madoff's pyramid collapsed by coincidence. The 2008 crisis struck, leading too many investors to seek their funds and opt for withdrawals. Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison. That brings the story to a close. Despite this significant lesson, new financial pyramids continue to emerge and ultimately collapse. This stems from our persistent curiosity about how to amass wealth quickly. While we all recognize that returns of 50 to 80% or even 100% are unrealistic promises, we also understand that a company must possess a license to engage in financial activities. Without this, investors' money lacks any form of protection. Furthermore, we comprehend that free cheese only exists in a mousetrap. In most cases, substantial earnings are directly. We all recognize that returns of 50, 80%, or even 100% are unrealistic promises. We also understand that a company must hold a license to engage in financial activities. Otherwise, investors' money lacks any form of protection. We also realize that free cheese only exists in a mousetrap, and that in most cases, substantial earnings are directly proportional to the effort exerted. Here, we may be nearing the core reason why financial pyramids and fraudulent schemes succeed, as well as why anyone can fall victim to them. Humans possess an evolutionarily advanced mechanism for trust. In fact, we are inclined to trust strangers more than to distrust them. Our survival, as well as the survival of our offspring, hinges on this. Few would want to form a family or friendship with someone incapable of trust, with someone who perceives deceit, conspiracy, or hidden motives in everything. Greetings to the conspiracy theorist in the comments. Moreover, you will never be able to build a business or launch any large-scale or even small project without trusting strangers. In most instances, when we place our trust in others, we are more likely to gain an advantage rather than lose out. Yes, there are times when this principle does not hold true, but financial pyramids and fraudsters only thrive in a world where absolutely no one trusts anyone. Yet, who would want to live in such a world? In most cases, when we extend our trust to others, we are more likely to gain an advantage rather than suffer a loss. Yes, there are times when this principle may not apply, but financial pyramids and fraudsters only exist in a world where absolutely no one trusts anyone.